Thank you and welcome to this April World Economic Outlook. It is 1 year into the COVID-19 pandemic, and the global community still confronts extreme social and economic strain as human toll rises and millions remain unemployed. Yet, even with high uncertainty about the path of the pandemic, a way out of this health and economic crisis is increasingly visible. Thanks to the ingenuity of the scientific community, hundreds of millions of people are being vaccinated, and this is expected to power recoveries in many countries later this year. Economies also continue to adapt to new ways of working despite reduced mobility, leading to a stronger than anticipated rebound across regions. Additional fiscal support in large economies, particularly in the United States, has further improved the outlook. We are now projecting a stronger recovery for the global economy compared with our January forecast, with growth projected to be 6% in 2021 and 4.4% in 2022, after an estimated historic contraction of minus 3.3% in 2020. Nonetheless, the future presents daunting challenges. The pandemic is yet to be defeated, and virus cases are accelerating in many countries. Recoveries are also diverging dangerously across and within countries as economies with slower vaccine rollout, more limited policy support, and more reliant on tourism do less well. The upgrades in global growth for 2021 and 2022 are mainly due to upgrades for advanced economies, particularly to a sizable upgrade for the United States that is expected to grow at 6.4% this year. Now, this makes the United States the only large economy projected to surpass the level of GDP it was forecast to have in 2022 in the absence of this pandemic. Other advanced economies, including the euro area, will also rebound this year, but at a slower pace. Among emerging markets and developing economies, China is projected to grow this year at 8.4%. Now, while China's economy had already returned to pre-pandemic GDP in 2020, many other countries are not expected to do so until 2023. Now, these diverging recovery paths are likely to create wider gaps in living standards across countries compared to pre-pandemic expectations. The average annual loss in per capita GDP over 2020 to 24 relative to pre-pandemic forecasts is projected to be 5.7% in low-income countries and 4.7% in emerging markets. While in advanced economies, the losses are expected to be smaller at 2.3%. Such losses are reversing gains in poverty reduction, with an additional 95 million people expected to have entered the ranks of the extreme poor in 2020 compared with pre-pandemic projections. Uneven recoveries are also occurring within countries as young and low-skilled workers and women remain more heavily affected. Now, because the crisis has accelerated the transformative forces of digitalization and automation, many of the jobs lost are unlikely to return, requiring worker reallocation across sectors, which unfortunately often comes with severe earning penalties. Swift policy action worldwide, including $16 trillion in fiscal support, prevented far worse outcomes. our estimates suggest last year's severe collapse could have been 3 times worse had it not been for such support. Now, because the financial crisis was averted, medium-term losses are expected to be smaller, though still substantial than after the global financial crisis at around 3%. However, unlike the 2008 crisis, this time it is emerging markets and low-income countries that are expected to suffer greater scarring given their more limited policy space. Now, a high degree of uncertainty surrounds the projections. Faster progress with vaccinations can uplift the forecast, while a more prolonged pandemic with virus variants that evade vaccines can lead to a sharp downgrade. Multi-speed recoveries could pose financial risks if interest rates in the United States rise further in unexpected ways. This could cause inflated asset valuations to unwind in a disorderly manner, financial conditions to tighten sharply, and recovery prospects to deteriorate, especially for some highly leveraged emerging markets and developing economies. Now, policymakers will need to continue supporting their economies while dealing with more limited policy space and higher debt levels than prior to the pandemic. This requires better targeted measures to leave space for prolonged support if needed. With multi-speed recoveries, a tailored approach is necessary with policies well calibrated at this stage of the pandemic, the strength of the economic recovery, and the structural characteristics of individual countries. Right now, the emphasis should be on escaping the health crisis by prioritizing healthcare spending on vaccinations, treatments, healthcare infrastructure. Fiscal support should be well targeted to affected households and farms, and monetary policy should remain accommodative while proactively addressing financial stability risks. As the pandemic is beaten back and labor market conditions normalize, support such as worker retention measures should be gradually scaled back. At that point, more emphasis should be placed on reallocating workers, including through targeted hiring subsidies and reskilling of workers. As exceptional measures, such as moratorium on loan payments are withdrawn, farm insolvencies could rise sharply and put 1 in 10 jobs at risk in many countries. To limit long-term damage, countries should consider converting previous liquidity support into equity-like support for viable farms, while developing out-of-court restructuring frameworks to expedite eventual bankruptcies. Resources should also be devoted to helping children catch up on lost instructional time during the pandemic. Now, once the health crisis is over, policy efforts can focus more on building resilient, inclusive, and greener economies, both to bolster the recovery and to raise potential output. The priority should include green infrastructure investment to help mitigate climate change, digital infrastructure investment to boost productive capacity, and strengthening social assistance to arrest rising inequality. Now, financing these endeavors will be more difficult for economies with limited fiscal space. In such cases, improving tax capacity, increasing tax progressivity, deploying carbon pricing, and eliminating wasteful expenditures will be essential. All countries should anchor policies in credible medium-term frameworks and adhere to highest standards of transparency to help contain borrowing costs and eventually reduce debt and rebuild buffers for the future. On the international stage, first and foremost, countries need to work together to ensure universal vaccination. While some countries will get to widespread vaccinations by the summer, most will likely have to wait till the end of next year. Speeding up vaccinations will require ramping up vaccine production and distribution, avoiding export controls, fully funding COVAX facility, and ensuring equitable global transfers of excess doses. Policymakers should also continue to ensure adequate access to international liquidity. The major central bank should provide clear guidance on future actions with ample time to prepare to avoid taper tantrum kinds of episodes, as occurred in 2013. Low-income countries will benefit from further extending the pause on debt repayments under the Debt Service Suspension Initiative and operationalizing the G20 Common Framework for orderly debt restructuring.